For 22 years, a homeowners association collected fees for a lake they never legally owned, and not one of their 34 members thought to ask for the paperwork. When a retired actuary bought the abandoned mill upstream and quietly requested a single recorded document, the HOA sent police to his door instead of an answer. They assumed he was just another homeowner who could be pressured into paying and forgetting. What they didn't know was that he had spent nearly 3 decades reading the fine print on other people's disasters, and that the dam sitting on his property controlled every drop of water in their lake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The sheriff's deputy stood at the edge of the dock and watched a 30-foot sloop settle slowly onto the mudflat with a sound like a groan from something very old and very tired. The boat's hull kissed the lake bottom at precisely 11:47 in the morning, which was, as it happened, the exact minute that the attorney for Cormorant Shore's Homeowners Association stood up in Havenport County Superior Court and said, "Your Honor, my client has maintained exclusive recreational use of this lake for over 2 decades." Deputy Marsh looked at the boat. He looked at the retreating water line. He wrote nothing in his notebook. Caleb Mercer stood beside the sluice gate of the old Cormorant Mill dam and watched the water move. He had opened the gate at 9:52 that morning in the presence of the deputy, an inspector from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and a notary public he had driven up from Montpelier himself. He had signed 3 forms before touching the mechanism. He had photographed each signature. Then he had turned the iron wheel 1 full rotation clockwise, and 22 years of accumulated assumptions had begun, very quietly, to drain. He had bought the mill 14 months earlier for $147,000, which everyone in Havenport agreed was either a steal or a trap. The listing had appeared in October, buried between a foreclosed ski lodge and a parcel of swamp marketed optimistically as wetland with potential. Historic grist mill, 1887, stone construction, operational dam, 4.2 acres, mill pond included, motivated seller. The photographs showed a building that had not been motivated to do much of anything since approximately 1971, when the last miller had locked the door and moved to Florida. Caleb had driven up from Hartford on a Tuesday, walked the property alone, and spent 40 minutes reading the title report in his car before he called his attorney. He had spent 28 years calculating risk for an insurance company. He knew how to read a document. The title report contained, in paragraph 7, the phrase, "RIPARIAN RIGHTS appurtenant to the dam structure and its operation, conveyed in fee simple with the property." The selling agent's attorney had mentioned some neighbors with an interest in the lake, in a tone that suggested this was the sort of thing one didn't need to worry about. Caleb had written the phrase down in his notebook and worried about it extensively. He closed on the property November 3rd and moved in that weekend with 4 boxes of books, a set of cast-iron cookware, and a Bose radio. His nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away through maple trees that had gone the color of a house fire. The lake behind the mill was steel gray and cold and entirely silent. He stood on the dam in the late afternoon light and thought, "This is a reasonable place to be." The envelope arrived 3 days later. It was cream-colored, with a tasteful logo, a heron over water, and the return address of the Cormorant Shore's Homeowners Association. The letter inside welcomed him to the community in 2 warm paragraphs and then informed him, in a 3rd paragraph considerably less warm, that his annual recreational easement fee for lake access was $3,400, due December 1st, and that failure to pay would result in restricted access to association-managed water resources. Caleb read it twice. He poured a cup of coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his notebook to a fresh page. and at the top he wrote, "Who? On what basis? What document?" He sent his first letter to the association on November 12th, a single page, politely worded, requesting a copy of the recorded easement granting Cormorant Shores authority over the lake, along with the instrument number and recording date at the Havenport County Registry of Deeds. Diane Westergaard called him 4 days later. She had the voice of a woman accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room, and she explained, with considerable patience, that the fee had always been paid, that the previous mill owner, a man named Doucette, had paid it for 11 years without complaint, and that Caleb was, of course, welcome to look into the history if that made him comfortable, but that the association had been managing the lake since 2003, and there was really nothing to look into. "I appreciate that," Caleb said. "I'd still like the instrument number." There was a pause. "I'll have our attorney's office send something over." Nothing came. He drove to the Registry of Deeds on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours with a county clerk named Rosario, who had worked there for 16 years and knew the filing system the way a musician knows a familiar score. They searched under every variation of Cormorant Shores, HOA, Homeowners Association, Recreational Easement, and Lake Access. Rosario pulled the physical deed books for the relevant parcels going back to 1940. She was thorough and unhurried, and at the end she looked at Caleb over her reading glasses and said, "There's nothing here." Caleb wrote that down. He met Rufus Pelletier the following week, when the old man appeared at the mill's side door with a paper bag containing a jar of maple syrup and an expression of someone delivering news they'd been sitting on too long. Rufus was 78, retired from 26 years with the Vermont Department of Forests, and had lived on the far side of the ridge since before the HOA existed or the word amenity had reached Havenport County. He had known the mill when it ran. He had, as a young man, helped stack lumber on its loading dock. "They'll come at you sideways," he said, accepting coffee at Caleb's kitchen table. "Diane Westergaard ran real estate in Burlington before she lost her license. She knows how to make people feel like they've already lost before they start." "She hasn't filed anything," Caleb said. "She will. She needs this lake. She sold 6 of those lots herself back in '04 and '05. If someone rules the water doesn't belong to the HOA, those properties drop maybe 30%. Her own house goes with them." Caleb looked at his notebook. "That's a useful thing to know," he said. The police came on a Friday morning in January, which was either dramatic or routine, depending on your perspective. 2 officers from the Havenport County Sheriff's Department, professional and apologetic, who had received a complaint from the HOA that Caleb had made verbal threats to interfere with the water supply of multiple residences. He had made no such threats. He had, at a brief and unpleasant conversation at his mailbox 10 days earlier, told Diane Westergaard's vice president that he was considering all options regarding the dam's operation. This had apparently been interpreted with considerable creative license. Caleb invited the officers in. He showed them his notebook, which contained dated entries of every interaction with the HOA. He showed them the letter requesting the easement document and the absence of any response. He offered them coffee. They declined and left, and the incident report went into the county system. It also went into Caleb's notebook. The HOA had now, in an official document, publicly claimed authority over the lake's water supply. He had not asserted this claim, they had. The distinction would matter. In February, a letter arrived from Gregory Haas, Esquire, of Haas and Burke, Burlington, who described himself as counsel for Cormorant Shores HOA, and who informed Caleb in 3 pages of aggressive prose that the association intended to file a quiet title action to establish their rights over the lake's surface and recreational use, and that Caleb would be wise to consult an attorney. The letter had a vaguely triumphant tone, as if the matter were already settled. Caleb called Daniel Kwan the next morning. Kwan had an office in Montpelier that contained more boxes than furniture, and a reputation among Vermont property attorneys that was difficult to summarize except to say that opposing counsel had learned not to mistake his quietness for inattention. He had once spent 11 months on a case involving a disputed access road, during which time he had said almost nothing in public, and had, at trial, produced a survey map from 1894 that made opposing counsel's entire argument structurally unsound. Kwan listened to the summary. He looked at the documents Caleb had assembled. He asked 3 questions. He said, "I'll need a week with the chain of title." Caleb said he understood. He was good at waiting. While Kwan worked through the deed books, Caleb drove to Hartford. He still had contacts at his former employer, a reinsurance company whose archives occupied a climate-controlled basement in a building no one was meant to remember existed. He was looking for something specific. In 1962, the mill had been insured by a predecessor company, and actuarial surveys had been filed as part of the underwriting process. The surveys documented structural conditions, operational parameters, and water management capacity for any insured hydraulic structure. He found the report on a Wednesday afternoon, behind a divider marked Vermont, Hydraulic Structures, Active. 34 pages, typed on paper the color of old bone, with hand-drawn diagrams and columns of water level measurements. The report identified the dam as the sole control structure for the Cormorant Mill Pond watershed, established the project design elevation, the intended maximum operational water level, as 4 feet and 3 inches above the mill race intake, and noted that the riparian rights conveyed with the mill extended to regulation of all water resources within the upstream impoundment. There were precise coordinates for the survey baseline, expressed in a notation system Caleb recognized from his own professional training. He photographed every page. He had the originals certified by the archive's records custodian. The report had been prepared by his company's actuarial predecessor. He had spent his career building on their methods. In a way he found difficult to articulate, the document felt like a message from people who had been careful before him, left for someone who would know how to use it. Sonia Arkhangelskaya drove up from Burlington on a gray March morning, with equipment cases in the back of her truck, and the specific, purposeful energy of someone who considers a problem a gift. She was 38, a hydrologist at the University of Vermont who had published extensively on riparian water rights in New England and had testified in 3 separate water use cases in the past 4 years. Rufus had known her father, which was how the introduction had happened. She set up monitoring stations along the shoreline and at the dam face and took readings for 3 days. On the 4th day, she sat across from Caleb at the mill table with a printout and said, "The current water level is 2.3 feet above the 1987 design elevation. The dam hasn't been managed to specification in at least 15 years, probably longer. Whoever has been responsible for this structure has not been maintaining it." "The HOA has been claiming responsibility," Caleb said. Sonia looked at him carefully. "That's interesting," she said. Kwan called the same week. His voice on the phone had the particular flatness of someone who has found something significant and is choosing his words. "The association incorporated in 2003, he said. "The mill property predates their existence by 116 years. The riparian rights attached to the dam are prior in time and therefore prior in right under Vermont water law. The HOA has no recorded easement, no riparian claim, and no legal basis for the fee they've been collecting." He paused. "They've been collecting it from 34 households, at $3,400 per household per year for 22 years. Caleb already had the multiplication done. $2,448,800, he said. "Approximately," Kwan said, "plus interest. Discovery will be interesting." Discovery was interesting. Quan filed Caleb's quiet title action in Havenport County Superior Court in April, asserting ownership of the lake surface and the riparian rights attached to the mill property. Haas responded aggressively, arguing adverse possession, that 22 years of HOA use constituted sufficient grounds for a claim of title. The case moved into its preliminary phases with the deliberate pace of Vermont litigation, which is to say, slightly faster than glacier movement, but not by enough to make anyone comfortable. The subpoena duces tecum, requesting the HOA's financial and corporate records, arrived at Diane Westergaard's home on a Tuesday. Caleb had not seen this directly, but Rufus had, because Rufus lived 2 miles away and had a neighbor who delivered mail on that route. The neighbor reported that Diane had stood on her porch holding the envelope for a long time before going inside. What came out of the HOA's records in discovery was, to use Quan's word, clarifying. Among the documents produced was a series of liability insurance policies covering association property from 2003 through 2019. The policies listed, as covered infrastructure, the Cormorant Mill Dam and associated water control structures. The HOA had been paying annual premiums to insure a structure they were simultaneously claiming they had no connection to. The insurance designation also identified the HOA as responsible party for the dam's maintenance and operational compliance. They had accepted this designation, in writing, for 16 consecutive years. They had never performed any maintenance. The dam's current condition, per Sonia's survey, reflected this. The insurer, upon receiving a copy of Sonia's findings through Quan's office, sent the HOA a notice of material breach. Haas called Quan the same afternoon. Quan took the call, listened for 4 minutes and said, "I'll pass that along to my client." He told Caleb that Haas had suggested an informal resolution. "What are his terms?" Caleb asked. "He didn't specify. I believe he was hoping you would propose terms." "We have a court date," Caleb said. They kept the court date. A second crack appeared in the HOA's position when Paul Einhorn came to the mill unannounced on a Wednesday evening. He was 51, a retired high school chemistry teacher who had owned his lakeside house for 17 years and paid his HOA fees reliably, in the way that people who trust institutions pay their fees without examining them closely. He had received, through the local rumor network that functions more efficiently in small Vermont towns than most digital systems, a general account of what the discovery documents contained. He sat down at Caleb's kitchen table, the same table at which Rufus had sat 4 months earlier, and said, "I want to understand what I've been paying for." Caleb showed him the relevant documents, the absent easement, the insurance policies, the calculations. Einhorn looked at the total figure for a long time. "I paid $3,400 a year for 17 years, he said. $57,800, Caleb said, because he had already calculated it. Einhorn retained his own attorney the following week. His lawsuit was against the HOA, not Caleb. It was joined within a month by 9 other homeowners. Diane Westergaard resigned from the HOA board at a meeting in May that was, by multiple accounts, not pleasant. She had sold 5 properties along the lake in 2004 and 2005, during the brief period when the HOA's marketing had made the lake feel like an amenity rather than a question mark. Her own house, a cedar-sided structure with a dock and a view of the water, had been worth $420,000 at its last appraisal. She had made her life around this place. She had believed, perhaps genuinely, that the system she'd built was solid enough to bear weight. It was not. The operation was scheduled for a Thursday in June, which Sonia had identified as optimal for water level management given current inflow rates from the feeder streams. Vermont Agency of Natural Resources had reviewed Caleb's maintenance application and approved it after a 23-day review. The dam had been classified as a Class B hydraulic structure, meaning its modification required state oversight and documentation. Caleb had submitted everything required, in the correct order, with the correct attachments, because he was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. He arrived at the dam at 8:45. The ANR inspector arrived at 9. Deputy Marsh arrived at 9:15 and positioned himself at a respectful distance. The notary arrived at 9:30 with a briefcase and the professional demeanor of someone who has notarized stranger things. At 9:52, Caleb signed the final maintenance log, handed one copy to the inspector, retained one, and turned the iron wheel one full rotation clockwise. The sound was not dramatic. A low, sustained rush of water through the gate, a change in the surface pattern of the mill pond, and then the slow, visible retreat of the shoreline on the far side of the lake. Caleb watched the water move. He had spent 28 years measuring the probability of things going wrong. He had rarely had occasion to measure the probability of things going exactly as documented. The court session that morning ran 3 hours. Quan laid out the case with the systematic efficiency of someone who has organized the same information multiple times and has identified the precise sequence that makes it impossible to dispute. The chain of title beginning in 1887, the actuarial survey of 1962, entered as Exhibit C, with Sonia's certification that its elevation data matched current survey benchmarks within acceptable tolerances. The letters from the 1950s and 1960s, in which the HOA's predecessor organization had written to the mill's then owner, requesting permission to use the lake's surface. Requests that had been granted by individual letters, not by recorded easement. The insurance policies in which the HOA had accepted responsibility for the dam. The absence, documented through Rosario's thorough search, of any recorded easement in the county records. Haas argued adverse possession with considerable energy. The HOA, he said, had exercised open, notorious, hostile, and continuous use of the lake for over 20 years, which met the standard under Vermont law. Quan waited for him to finish. Then he said, "Counsel's client paid liability insurance premiums on the dam structure for 16 of those years. Those payments were accompanied by a signed designation of the HOA as responsible party. You cannot simultaneously claim hostile adverse possession of a property and voluntarily assume insurance liability for its maintenance. The insurance payments constitute an acknowledgement of the owner's superior title, which defeats the hostility element required for adverse possession." He placed the insurance documents on the plaintiff's table in a neat stack. Judge Eleanor Tharp looked at the stack. She looked at Haas. She said, "Counsel, would you like a recess?" Haas said he would. She gave him 20 minutes. He came back and said the HOA would like to discuss settlement. Judge Tharp said, "You're in my courtroom. Let's finish this." The ruling came down 4 weeks later, 12 pages, written in the careful and precise language that Vermont courts use when they want to make something difficult to misinterpret later. The Cormorant Mill's riparian rights, established by the deed of 1887 and appurtenant to the dam structure and its operation, constituted prior and superior claim to the lake's surface and water management. The HOA held no recorded easement and no adverse possession claim. The quiet title action was granted in favor of Caleb Mercer. The HOA was ordered to account for all recreational fees collected from its members and to provide restitution. The accounting, when it was finally completed by a court-appointed neutral, came to $2,512,040, including interest. The HOA's reserves covered approximately $61,000 of this. The remainder would be the subject of additional litigation, principally involving the individual board members who had approved the fee collection without legal authority. Haas filed a motion for reconsideration. Judge Tharp denied it in 6 sentences. He sent the HOA a bill for $340,000 for his services. The HOA disputed the bill in small claims court. They lost. Diane Westergaard's house went on the market in September. The listing described it as a unique lakefront property with water views. The asking price was $295,000. It sold the following spring for $262,000. Paul Einhorn organized the reorganization of Cormorant Shore's HOA over the winter, working from a borrowed conference room at the Havenport Public Library. He was methodical about it. He brought in a property attorney to review the governing documents. He reached out to Caleb through Kwan's office in November. They met at the mill on a Saturday. Einhorn brought a folder. Caleb made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and negotiated a recreational easement for the lake surface in approximately 40 minutes, which was fast by any standard, but felt right given the circumstances. The terms were straightforward. 32 member households of the reorganized association, 2 had declined to rejoin, would have non-exclusive recreational use of the lake surface from May 1st through October 31st, for an annual fee of $200 per household. The easement was recorded in the Havenport County Registry of Deeds on December 14th, instrument number 44-279016. Rosario filed it herself. Caleb had a brass plate made at a shop in Burlington. He hung it on the gate post at the mill entrance on the first Saturday in October, which was also the day Rufus came over with a bottle of Vermont hard cider from a farm he'd been buying from since before Caleb had moved to the county. The maple trees along the ridge had gone the same color they'd been when Caleb first arrived, orange and deep red, and a yellow so bright it seemed almost aggressive. Sonia's paper on the case, Prior Appropriation and Riparian Priority in Post-Colonial New England Water Law, Cormorant Mill as Precedent, was published in the Vermont Law Review the following spring. She thanked Caleb in the acknowledgments for access to archival materials and an exceptionally well-maintained notebook. The notebook was, by that point, on its 3rd volume. Caleb sat at the kitchen table on an evening in late October and looked at the water through the old mill windows. The lake surface stood precisely at the design elevation established in 1887. He had run the probability of someone challenging the recorded easement. He came out at 4.7%, assuming a 10-year window and no significant change in Vermont property law. Rufus had asked him once whether he'd known from the beginning how it would go. "No," Caleb had said. "I knew what the document said. That's different." The water held its level as the light went out of the sky. The old iron wheel sat still above the sluice gate, one rotation clockwise from where it had been, doing exactly what the deed of 1887 had always said it could do. The mill had been waiting a long time for someone to read the fine print. It turned out that was what Caleb had been doing his whole career. What won this case wasn't a dramatic courtroom speech or a last-minute witness. It was a 34-page actuarial survey from 1962 that nobody had looked at in decades. Caleb Mercer succeeded because he understood something most people miss. In property disputes, the oldest document in the room almost always wins. Under Vermont's riparian water law, rights attached to a dam in 1887 carry priority over anything a homeowners association incorporated in 2003 could ever claim, and no amount of collected fees changes that timeline. The HOA's fatal mistake wasn't arrogance, though there was plenty of it. It was the 16 years of liability insurance premiums they paid on a structure they claimed wasn't theirs. Because under adverse possession law, you cannot simultaneously declare hostile ownership of a property and voluntarily accept maintenance responsibility for it in a signed insurance contract. That single contradiction collapsed their entire legal position in one argument. The quiet title action is one of the most powerful tools in American property law, and it rewards exactly the kind of patience and documentation that most people can't sustain. Caleb could, because patience and documentation had been his profession. In the end, the lake sat at the elevation it was always supposed to be at, the one written down in 1887 before anyone thought to charge for it. Which raises a reasonable question. When did you last read the actual paperwork on something you've been paying for?